There's an election coming up. Maybe you've heard something about it. Maybe you've heard that the House of Representatives is in play. Maybe you've heard that there's even a long shot, very long shot, but not impossible chance for Democrats to take the Senate as well. Maybe this is an opportunity to stop the onward rush of chaos, the tsunami of nightmarish evil that has been unleashed thanks to not just Donald Trump, but the entire Republican Party. Maybe you've heard something about it, but then why vote? Okay, well, that's what we're going to talk about right now, why we should, in fact, vote. Why, if you're listening to this show, for example, on Saturday, you have 4 more days to vote. If you're listening to this show on Monday, you have 1 more day to vote. And I think if it's past Tuesday, you really should have voted. So here to talk about reasons for voting now with me is my good friend, Alex Lawson. You know him well. Alex is the executive director of Social Security Works. He is also the co-founder of We Act Radio, the media empire in which I reside as I speak these words. And he is also one of the founders of Strong Arm Press. So he joins us now. Alex, thanks for coming back.
Thanks for having me, as always.
So, like, I'm a little alienated, and I got a lot on my mind, and there's a constant internal psychodrama playing out on the interior of my skull. And so I'm just thinking I might be too preoccupied to vote this Tuesday. And what are your thoughts about that?
I do understand where people, say that they're not going to vote. I do. And I think that, I hear it from like, well, I don't think that the Democratic Party represents, right, something like that. Or my vote won't even matter. I don't think that one vote counts. Or, it's just 2 sides of the same coin or anything like that. I think we've all heard it. And the thing is, if your vote didn't matter, why would Wall Street and their goons literally spend hundreds of millions of dollars and push out an army of reactionary goons to restrict voting, right? To make it as difficult as possible for people to vote, especially people of color, especially poorer folks, especially folks with limited mobility. The reason is because we do have power with our vote. It's not the only power that we have. So I want to make that clear. And that's important because voting is not the only thing you should do. Like, you can't just vote and be like, done, right? You have to stay active because as you, in your lead-in, I mean, we're literally watching a sprint towards full authoritarian or fascist control is what we're looking at. I mean, just look in Brazil. They literally elected a person who worked for the military dictatorship and is openly calling for a return to that. I mean, like, the stakes are high here.
Yeah, and no, the stakes are enormously high, and you make a great point about the money that people are spending trying to get people not to vote. And just to be clear, I don't make fun of people who are alienated from the voting process for a variety of reasons. So, for example, it might have sounded like I was in my introduction, but there really is a psychodrama playing out on the inside of my head.
I know that.
You know that. We're friends. And so what I'm really getting at, I think, is it's an issue we need to tear apart a little bit. One of the things that I think people need to be cognizant of is, on the one hand, you have these enormous forces trying to prevent people from voting. And this is going to be a 3-handed analogy. On the second hand, you have people offering them hate and fear and all the things they've been offered for decades, but in sort of pumped up, amplified, hyper form. And on the third, let's face it, let's be honest, before we go further, a lot of people in the Democratic Party or aligned with the Democratic Party have the tendency to lecture people who are reluctant to vote for him, to lecture people who might think, well, maybe I want to vote green, or maybe I'm alienated from the process, or maybe as opposed to, to me, that's a violation of what I consider a fundamental rule of politics, which is that it's a sales job. And that if they don't vote for you, you've got to look at what you might have done to make the sale next time around. So I'm not knocking people who are thinking of voting for the third party, who are staying home, any of those things. I'm just saying, I can't say it enough in my own head. It really, really matters what happens.
Yeah, I think that there's also, it's a four-handed analogy. I don't know if I can keep this going, but there are reactionary forces of austerity within the Democratic Party that need to be defeated. That the progressive side of the Democratic Party has not been in ascendancy for a generation, right? I mean, the overreaction to Reagan had Democrats running on like, well, we're the less terrible them, right? Like, we'll only punch you in the face once.
Right.
Not all of them. We've always had champions, but it is hard to miss that too many Democratic policies were not about making people's lives better. They were about like slowing down people's lives getting worse, right? They weren't about like sending Wall Street criminals to prison and breaking the power structure that's been robbing us blind. They were like, well, let's just, let's kind of equalize. I don't even know what it is because it was just in the Obama era. Those same Wall Street bankers who crashed the world economy got like massive amounts of our money, right?
They got massive amounts of our money. If they were running GE and GE Capital, they got appointed heads of the presidential jobs. Here's where I guess what would he call it? The Jobs Council? He renamed it the Jobs Council, but he gave it to Jeff Immelt, who was the head of GE, and GE Capital was one of the worst actors in the financial crisis, one of the worst purveyors of bad mortgages and so on. So believe me, I want radical change. Not only do I want radical change, I think that radical change is our only hope of preventing massive catastrophe on multiple fronts. And then you get into the question, well, okay, if you believe in radical change, why would you vote for some of these Democrats? And I have an answer to that, but I want to hear yours.
Well, first of all, we have to actually push candidates to be as radical, as progressive as possible. We have to demand that that's what they are running on. That's why we're voting for them. And I might not answer your question. Let's return to it because I want to get into this one fight that's happening right now on the left, in the Democratic Party. And it's a battle of narratives right now where from John Bowser-Baumann, John, who is the president of the Social Security Works PAC, he's done 57 in-person endorsement events all across the country. And he has seen, I have the questionnaires, people are running on expanding Social Security, expanding Medicare, expanding Medicaid, taking federal action to lower prescription drug prices. It doesn't matter where they are. They're running on an extremely progressive platform. And that's true. That's because that's where the energy is. That's because people are fighting for this. But you have the forces of Wall Street within the Democratic Party, the third way, who are literally the forces of Wall Street. And many of them actually come out of Chuck Schumer's office. And the third way is going around telling this other story that's like, oh, yeah, well, they're saying that, but they're lying to the people. Don't worry, Wall Street. They're just saying that to get elected, and then once they get power, we're going to get them, and they'll be our guys, and they'll pull the lever for us. That dynamic is absolutely toxic and is so dangerous. There's no faster way for us to actually get into a Bolsonaro Brazilian thing than for that, right? If the Democrats get elected on a wave of progressive anger demanding real change, and then the Democratic Party delivers this milquetoast pro-Wall Street, I'm only going to punch you in the face once instead of twice, then people will walk away. Well, I mean, they'll walk away so fast, it's the fastest way to ensure a loss in 2020. So we have to not only vote, but vote loudly. Make it clear why we're voting. Make it clear why we're getting out in the streets and knocking doors and doing all the things, right? And then after we vote, we have to demand the Democratic Party carry progressive power and not Wall Street.
Which gets to a point I wanted to make for a long time and probably have made, but want to keep making. And again, we're talking with Alex Lawson, Executive Director of Social Security Works, about the election. And it's that Wall Street and the bastards who run big American corporations, they see exactly what politicians, they view politicians as their instruments, as their tools. They don't think they're the ones who set the agenda. They don't see them as the leaders. They don't follow them. They do everything they can to control them. Whereas I think one of the misconceptions that progressives as a body have tended to make is that sometimes I think we still look to politicians to lead us. So when we cast so a centrist progressive, for example, or a centrist Democrat might say, well, I'm voting for this person because I think they'll lead us in the right direction. And a really good, solid progressive might say, well, I'm not going to vote for them because I don't think they want to go where I want to go. And I think both those worldviews are wrong. I think that the way we need to think about politicians going forward is that we comprise a movement. And we, the movement, will lead. And the politicians can either be our partners or they can be the people we lean on to do what we want. But we have to stop thinking that some superhero is going to come along and lead the Democratic Party and lead us into the promised land. We have to demand the promised land.
The cavalry isn't coming.
We are the cavalry.
We are the cavalry. And what you just laid out is exactly right. We have to play the same game that money power is playing. People power has to play the exact same game. They don't see voting as like, the end all and be all thing, but they're definitely going to try to use political power because there's a lot of power there. But then they're going to use all the other forms of power that are available to them that they can use, right? Corporate media, a giant propaganda megaphone. So people power has to play that same game. They have to look at voting as one step. It's one piece of it. And if you can't get exactly what you want, that makes perfect sense that you're not going to get exactly what you want. Get what you can get and keep getting more, keep demanding more, and keep the pressure up. That's just one of the, unless you're okay with the world being on fire, so a few dozen people can fly golden helicopters off of their golden yachts to their private little islands that they're where they can watch the world burn from, what else are you going to do? Or are we just going to sit back and do nothing while Wall Street takes everything from us? While just climate change alone, just on that one, between the two parties, right? You got a Democrat and a Republican. The Democrat's not perfect. He's not for whatever, right on. But the Democratic Party at least understands that climate change is real, right? They're not offering up bold enough solutions, but the Republican Party is full speed ahead, accelerating into climate change, right? That difference alone.
There's no question about it. And we can talk about that more a little bit after the upcoming break, because I do think climate change is a perfect example of this, because I think what the Democrats have proposed is way too weak, but much, at least prevents us from causing utter devastation in the meantime. So it's a good example of that. And but before we go to break, I do want to say about your punching people in the face just once instead of twice. There is a third way here where people are means tested for this to see how much they need to be punched in the face and then punch in the face accordingly. That is a think tank is coming up with that plan as we speak. Alex, one point I wanted to make before we went too much further, and I forgot, is that I think it's important to vote even if your district is, because of gerrymandering, going to go 80% for a Democrat, let's say. I think or for that matter, if it's going to vote 80% for a Republican, even if it's a shoo-in because it's been gerrymandered, I think it's important to vote because I think one of the arguments we need to make because of gerrymandering is to point out, and I think I was the first one to ever do it back in 2000 and after the 2004 election, was to actually, I went through manually totaled up all the votes for Democrats in Congress. There are other people who do it better now, like 538, but just totaled up all the votes and say, you know what, even when they don't win, they win the popular vote. I still think that's an important message to keep pointing out that Republicans represent only a minority of this country.
Yes, and there's so many more elections, right? This is another big point. There's so many elections that are down ticket. There's so many local elections, which even if you like just say all federal politics is like, I'm not, then just focus on local. I want you to vote all the way up and down, but like, that's the reason the gerrymandering is so bad, is because we've lost so many local elections because the corporate power understands how to play a long game, to slowly take all power and rig the game in their favor. They don't play fair. They never will play fair. So you have to show up, you do your research before you get to the voting booth and figure out, you know, all the way down the ticket, who are you going to vote for? Because those local races are sometimes, you know, more critical because they're going to decide who controls the state legislature that is going to draw those maps. And I just think that it's critical on so many levels that people go out and vote. If I actually had like one civics lesson that I could just really drive into everyone's brains, it's that there's an election every 2 years. Because so many people, especially young people, only vote on the presidential years, right? Like, do you think that we'd have a better shot at free college, at ending student debt, right? At all of those things if if young people showed up every single time and were as reliable voters as, say, seniors are, right? That would be a totally different scenario. Just one little quick look at that. In France, they one time tried to take away the stipend that university students were given, a public stipend that they were given to go to the free college where the textbooks are also free, and they just were trying to reduce the stipend. And the students barricaded themselves in on the left bank and held protests for weeks until the government was like, okay, never mind. That's what power is, right? Power is standing up for what you want. That's how the corporate power is getting everything they want. They got $1.5 trillion in a tax handout because they're wielding political power, right? Like that's what we have to be playing the same game that they're playing.
Well, and yeah, absolutely. And I think our identification, I just want to keep hammering that point. You don't have to feel like, man, that Steny Hoyer speaks for me in order to pull the lever. You don't. I mean, personally, you know, and I know this is a contentious issue. And look, I was a registered independent until last year because I got alienated from the Democratic Party, and I was much further to the left than what I perceived the party to be. And I was in California, which has open primaries, so it didn't matter. Then I moved to D.C., then I moved to Maryland. And when I moved to Maryland, my friend Ben Jealous was running in the primary. And so I wanted to be a part of that competition. I wanted to be a part of that conversation about who should represent the Democrats and ultimately the people of Maryland. And I wanted to help Ben Jealous, who I believed in, and still want to help him. So, but that doesn't mean that my consciousness changed. My consciousness of what I think the world needs to do, of the revolutionary, the transformational changes we need to make as a people, as a nation, as a planet, hasn't changed. That's a tactical decision that I make to become a Democrat again, to work within the democratic framework. So I know a lot of people, particularly what I suspect are paid trolls on the internet, as well as unpaid ones for centrist democratic policies, love to attack Susan Sarandon or Green Party voters or whatever. Those are, I think they're natural. My challenge to the Democratic Party is bring them in. Figure out how to, you know, again, politics is a sales job. That's a group of people you didn't make the sales to, the sell to. But so bring them in. But also, my call to the Democrats is, why are you fixated on the 1% who voted for Jill Stein and not the 48% who didn't vote at all?
Who didn't vote. Exactly. This is who we have to be talking about. Look, here's the facts. The Republicans will accelerate climate change, like they already are, right? And it seems like there is a global right wing that is a global authoritarian or fascist front that is forming. You're seeing it all across the globe. Brazil just went like as far right as we've seen in an election. A person who actually said he's getting elected but does not really believe in democracy, right? Like, we've terrifyingly seen that before in the 30s.
And we're also seeing, just to jump in for a second, we're seeing Marine Le Pen, who may well yet be the next president of France.
And AfD in Germany.
AfD in Germany is on the rise. Angela Merkel just this week said she's not running for re-election because things are stagnating for her party as well. And the socialist parties in France and Germany are like crushed. So these are scary times. So I think of it as, you know, one of those old movies where like the evil, like Lee Van Cleef has taken over the saloon, right? The first thing you do is stop Lee Van Cleef. You know, you may not like everybody in the saloon, but Lee Van Cleef is going to waste everybody. So
stop that guy.
Lee Marvin may not be that great because he's kind of a scary dude too, but he's not Lee Van Cleef. So you get where I'm going with that.
I do get it. I don't know if everyone gets it, but spaghetti westerns are definitely no.
If you don't, okay, and then hit me up on Twitter. I'll give you a viewing list.
To me, it's like, I get looking at climate change, at the reality of climate change, and saying, you know, cap and trade, are you kidding me? This is an old right-wing policy.
Right.
There's no way that that's going to stop. I get that, because it's true. And we need to actually nationalize, in a way, the extractive industries and then shut them down, right? Like, we need radical solutions to deal with climate change, but you don't get there in one, right? Like, the big oil does not just cease to exist because you stayed home on the election day, right? Like, and they're like, oh, well,
and
Eskow decided not to vote because the Democrats aren't putting forward bold enough policies. So I guess we, the multinational corporations in Wall Street, will just stop robbing people, right? Like, that's not how it works.
No, and the Democrats are not going to say, well, Eskow didn't vote, so I better radicalize myself to please Eskow. But this does get into an important point, one where there's a legitimate conversation to be had. It's pretty obvious where I fall on it, but that's the theory of change conversation. Because as long as I was a politics nerd at a very early age, and there's always been the kind of first of all, I hate incrementalism, especially in healthcare. The idea that if we just use private for-profit, rip-off health insurance companies in a slightly different way, that will somehow get us to Medicare for all. I don't believe that's true. But on the other hand, there's this counter theory of change that says things have to get really, really bad and then we'll have a revolution. That's been around as long as I've been around, and then some. And I don't happen to believe that's true. And I don't think history suggests that's true. I think history suggests that if you let things get really bad, sometimes then the really bad people destroy everything.
Actually, history shows that like over and over and over again. And we don't get really good things by walking away from them, right? I mean, like the accelerationists or Leninist strategy,
that's
like
the word
any of that to me is just total BS. It's never been, it's primarily from intense places of privilege, right? Like intense places of privilege. You don't see that coming from folks who are currently under the heel of Wall Street and corporatist authoritarians. So to me, power is kind of obvious. It really is to me. Power is the thing. It's the ability to get what you want, get the things that you want to happen. And so if your strategy does not allow you to do that, or is based on some sort of mythical, magical thinking that in the future somehow right? I mean, it's just going to all happen in one. That's just myth making. And I think half the people who push that stuff are literally paid by the federal government. You know, like just look at the history of COINTELPRO. It's not like you don't have to go into conspiracy fringe to see that that was a tactic of J. Edgar Hoover and the authoritarian right replayed all over the place to divide the left, right? Like, oh yeah, left, just a shoe power. Stop demanding justice, and if you do that enough, then you know the guy with his boot on your neck is gonna like give you a hand up. How does that make any sense? Right. We have to demand and build an unstoppable people power and wield political power to get what we want, and we have to walk in the right direction to do that.
And there's another dimension to this too. When we get to theory of change, which is a lot of people say. It's kind of the left anarchist position that I'm super sympathetic with, actually, that says we need to build institutions outside as the government framework, too. I mean, the Black Panthers had school lunch programs and breakfast programs for children, and they had put together clinics and all of that. And people from the left doing that in a self-organized manner, people from the left taking over cities and counties and learning how to govern at the local level in a different way. I support all of these decentralized movement activities, but the thing we also need to understand is that the sort of totalitarian right is looking to eradicate all that too. It's not like you can ignore the federal government because they're going to use the instrumentalities of the federal government to destroy these independent and local initiatives as well.
And we have to do both. We have to build. The power is not coming from down the street in the Capitol, right? The power is coming from the people. All power comes from the people. That's just true, right? Like, there's no denying it when you see change happen because, you know, thousands or millions of people come together and demand it clear and clarion what they want, and then that happens. It's clear then that power comes from the people. That's the only place it comes from, and we should be building all of our power centers outside in a decentralized way so that it can't just be co-opted or neutralized by, you know, removing one charismatic leader. There are lots of lessons to be learned there, but none of them take away from the lesson of use political power as one of the levers that you're fighting for, right? Like, we need to build this solidarity amongst as many people of good faith as possible to tackle these huge issues. We are up against some terrible odds here, right? Like, not odds, but some terrible power dynamics where if we don't unite huge swaths of the people, the billionaires have so much money that they can swamp us. So we do need to do everything we can to expand the pool of people who are fighting with us, who are standing with us, who understand what power is. And I know one of your viewers who doesn't like it when I guest host because I talk too much, and he wants to hear the guest. I always wonder what he thinks about when I'm the guest, and if he thinks I talk.
Well, let's ask him. We look forward to your comment. Look, we're running out of time, unfortunately, but you know, a couple things I guess that I would say in closing, and then I'll give you the last word, but don't talk too much, is
impossible.
Number one, you know, I'm not telling people think like a Democrat as you imagine a Democrat to be, or as a Democratic leadership is today, or do any of those things. I mean, if anything, be in the Democratic Party the way Thoreau was in it, but not of it. The way Thoreau was in the world. I think it was Thoreau. But secondly, you know, when Democrats, when you hear a Democratic leader say, "Well, we're capitalists and just the way it is," that's just the way it is. My answer is, well, this year, check back with me next year. And third, you know, as we've been saying all along, the party isn't the only, you know, instrument that we have at our disposal, and we shouldn't think of it that way. But I do think we should be thinking about creating the space for making the major change we want to see. That's my closing thought. What's yours?
The only path to getting to expanding Social Security, expanding Medicare to cover everyone, breaking pharmaceutical monopolies, taking on Wall Street. We need political power as one of the pieces to do that. So we can't we can't actually fight those fights without political power. So people just have to look at it and play the same game that Wall Street and the corporate titans are playing against us.
Well, in the words of Bob Dylan, things should start to get interesting right about now. We have an election coming up, but we'll have a lot of work afterwards, no matter what happens. So Alex Lawson, Executive Director of Social Security Works, thanks so much for coming on the program. You guys, please vote.